Chapter 1. The Whispering Canopy. The forest of Aelwendel had always breathed with a quiet, ancient life. Its towering canopies stretched like cathedral vaults, cloaking the sky in emerald shadow. Birds once sang here in dense choruses, deer flitted through the underbrush, and pilgrims lit incense at moss-covered stones to honor spirits long forgotten. But on this midsummer's eve, something vile had begun to stir in the soil. It started with a scent, sweet and cloying like overripe fruit fermenting in the sun. It hung in the air, thick and dizzying, making the squirrels in the branches sway and the foxes in their dens whimper. The wind whispered wrongness, murmurs too rhythmic, too deliberate, like breath over a lover's neck. Leaves turned rust-red, bark darkened with veins of black ichor. And then the blooms came. Flowers the size of a man's head blossomed in clusters, blood red with petals like torn muscle. Their centers pulsed faintly, revealing thorn-ringed maws that wept thin streams of pink mucus. They opened in a single night, covering the western glade and the road that cut through it. Trees twisted to lean closer, their branches no longer leafed, but taloned. That was where the Glimmerhook caravan disappeared. 4 wagons, 7 men, 2 women, and a mule team, they had left Wurtbad with spices, silvered lanterns, and barrels of smoked eel bound for Altdorf. None would arrive. 3 days later, a patrol of Empire road wardens rode in search of them. What they found silenced even the most seasoned soldier. The road to the glade narrowed into a tunnel of trees, their bark cracked and flaking like scabs. The silence was absolute. No birdsong, no chittering life. Just the creak of saddles and the slow drum of hooves on the hard-packed path. Corporal Hagen, a broad-shouldered man with half his face burned from a goblin firebomb, led the column. His horse snorted uneasily as they neared the clearing. Then the wind shifted. The stench hit them, a stifling blend of rot, coppery blood, and sickly sweet perfume. One of the riders gagged behind his hand. They emerged into the glade. The wagons stood in a broken ring like forgotten toys. The wheels had sunk halfway into the earth, which had turned spongy and red. One cart had overturned, spilling its contents, clay pots shattered, dried eel strips scattered like intestines. The canvas of another had been shredded, claw marks deep as axes carved into the wood. And then the blood. It was everywhere, splattered on tree trunks in arterial sprays, soaked into the earth like spilled wine. A wagon horse lay nearby, gutted from chest to hindquarter, its ribs split open like a butchered hog. Flies buzzed thick over its remains. The bones of its face had been crushed inward, as if gnawed by something massive. Hagen dismounted, sword drawn. He stepped slowly toward the center, boots squelching in the blood-mucked ground. "Form a perimeter," he barked, voice low. "If anything moves, kill it." There were no bodies, just the remnants of screams, scraps of clothing nailed to tree bark by wooden spikes grown like fangs. A child's doll, crushed under hoofprint-like indentations not made by any horse. One wagon's side had a smear of handprints. Too many fingers, claws at the tips, like something halfway between man and beast. And above all, the flowers. They bloomed from everything, sprouting from wagon wheels, from the eyes of the dead horse, even from the trunk of a tree where a shattered lantern had melted half the bark. One opened near Hagen's boot, releasing a puff of fine, glimmering red dust. He stumbled back as the scent hit his nose like fire. One of his men, Borrig, stumbled closer to another, hypnotized, reaching for its petals. "Borrig, stand down." Too late, the flower snapped open, revealing rows of thorned barbs within. With a sickening crunch, it clamped down on his hand, thorns punching through leather and flesh alike. Boric screamed, trying to tear it free, but the petals pulsed, alive and sucked deep, like leeches. Blood sprayed as he yanked back, the skin of his forearm peeling away in long ribbons. Hagen lunged, slicing the bloom in half. Boric collapsed, clutching the ruined stump of his arm, pale and wide-eyed. "Burn it," Hagen growled. "Burn it all." The men obeyed. Torches were lit, oil poured, and the fire caught quickly. But as the flames rose, the forest screamed. Not from animal throats, but from the trees themselves. Their trunks shuddered, leaves rustled without wind, and bark split to reveal dark veins, pumping something thick and red. Then came the sound, low and guttural, like a drum made from stretched hide and bone, echoing through the roots beneath them. It was not just a cursed glade. It was a wound, a bleeding hole between worlds. And something had begun to wake. Chapter 2. Oaths in Ashen Wood. The black antlers rode like iron shadows through the fog-choked valley below Alewindle, their formation tight and wordless. 30 men and women, armored in leather hardened by oil and age, helms marked by the horned crest of their banner. They had fought under many flags, hunting greenskin warbands in the Grey Mountains, purging necromances along the Styr, and once breaking the siege of Krugenheim with fire and steel, but none of them had ever marched into a place like this. Alewindle loomed ahead like a mouth, its trees forming jagged silhouettes against the sallow midsummer sky. The canopy swallowed light in layers, a cathedral of rotting green and whispering boughs. Fog clung low, cold and moist, and the wind carried a rancid perfume that no flower should exude. Captain Elar Vorn halted at the tree line, raising a fist. His black cloak hung heavy with dew. Scars lined his face, like a map of pain, one across the chin from a dwarf's axe, another near his right temple that never fully healed. His eyes were pale and sharp, blue as ice water under moonlight. In his hand was a bastard sword, blackened from years of flame and gore. His mount, a weathered destrier named Carrion, whickered softly. "This place reeks of the dark gods," he muttered, low and sharp. "Be wary." He turned in his saddle. "We're not here to die for coin," he told his troops. "We're here to find what happened to the Glimmerhook caravan, and if necessary, burn the cause to ash. No mercy, no quarter. And if any of you start hearing voices in the trees, cut your own throat before it gets worse." Some chuckled nervously, others just nodded. These were killers, but not fools. With a gesture, they moved into the trees. The moment they crossed the threshold, the light changed. Sunlight died between the trunks, reduced to thin beams like spears of fading gold. The trees leaned in, branches arching as though to eavesdrop. Underfoot, the soil was damp and black, broken by strange red vines that curled like veins over fallen logs and rocks. After an hour of silent progression, they came upon the remains of the Empire Patrol. Bodies, 6 of them, strung from branches like grotesque ornaments. Each hung by the ankles, armor stripped, entrails swaying like wind chimes. One had been hollowed out completely, skin sagging like a discarded wineskin. The other 5 had faces locked in silent screams, their eyes and mouths sewn shut with thorns. Corporal Bren, a thick-chested woman with one eye and a flanged mace, snarled. "By Moor's balls, what kind of creature does this?" "Not beast men," Vaughan said coldly. "This is ritual, art." They cut the corpses down with little ceremony, burning them in a small pyre doused with black powder-soaked rags. The smoke twisted strangely, spiraling toward the treetops as if devoured by the canopy itself. As the fire crackled, something moved in the distance. Sound. A rustling like dry bones over silk. Then came the laughter. High-pitched, mocking, not human. The black antlers drew steel, forming a half-circle around the captain. Vorn stared into the gloom. Shapes danced between the trees, too fast to catch, like flickers of smoke in a breeze. Then came the first attack. A blur from the right, Bren swung her mace with a scream. It connected with something wet and brittle. Blood sprayed, black and steaming, but whatever it was darted away, vanishing into the underbrush with a hiss. Then the trees themselves moved. Vorn shouted, "Shields up!" Something massive burst from the undergrowth, a twisted beast, vaguely canine, its flesh a patchwork of bark and sinew. Its jaws were a mess of antlers and bone. It lunged, tackling one of the mercenaries, pinning him beneath its weight. The man's scream was short. Claws dug into his throat, pulling it open like cloth. Blood sprayed across the trees, hissing as it hit the red blooms. They opened wider, shuddering as if in ecstasy. "Down it!" Vorn roared. Bolts and arrows slammed into the creature's hide. It thrashed, ripping apart another soldier before a spear caught it in the gut. Vorn leapt forward, driving his sword up through its chest. The thing convulsed, bark cracking, and fell into a pile of steaming rot and twigs. "Fan out," Vorn ordered, voice like gravel. "If this forest has a heart, we're cutting it out." They pressed on for hours, deeper into the ashen heart of Eiluindel. More signs appeared, blooms clinging to deer corpses like tumors, skulls embedded in tree bark, and one clearing where the ground pulsed like flesh underfoot. They passed no birds, no squirrels, nothing living but the wrong things. At dusk, they found the remnants of the Glimmerhook camp, torn wagons, shredded supplies, and bones, piles of them, stripped clean, arranged in spirals that glowed faintly under the dying light. Vorn dismounted. His hand traced the spiral. "They were offerings," he said quietly. "To what?" Bren asked. Vorn looked up, eyes narrowing as he stared into the darkness of the trees. "To the thing that lives here now. This forest isn't sick, it's reborn. Something's claimed it. Something old. Something that wants blood." He turned to his troops, lifting his blade. "From this moment on, we are not mercenaries. We are oath-bound." He sliced the tip of his thumb, letting blood drip onto the ash-covered soil. "By steel and fire, we end this rot." One by one, the others followed suit. Blood dripped like rain onto the earth. And far above, high in the boughs, something laughed. Chapter 3. Warbands stir. North of Eiluindel, where the winds shriek like dying men and the soil bleeds when pierced, the ground trembled beneath the feet of two armies, birthed from madness and blood. They came from different dominions, following the call of power that had begun to hum through the fabric of the world, a pulse, dark and alluring, beating from the cursed forest like the war drums of gods. The Brazen Claw were first. They came clad in brass and iron, their armor dented and smeared with the rust of slaughter. Khorne's mark burned red-hot on their flesh, some branded, others carved deep into bone and muscle. Their standard was a tree of skulls, lashed together with sinew, raised high by a champion whose face was hidden behind a helm shaped like a snarling bull. They marched in silence, save for the pounding of war drums, deep, slow beats that matched the rhythm of their tread and the thundering in their blood. At their head strode Guthak Skullrender, a monstrous warrior with a two-handed axe fused to his gauntlet by dried gore. Each swing was a prayer to the blood god. His body was a map of scars, and where his eyes once were now burned two pits of red flame, gifts from Khorne after the slaughter of the Grailwood Temple. The air around the warband shimmered with heat, even though snow still clung to the ground. Blood spilled from their skin with every breath, not wounding them, but sanctifying the earth beneath their boots. They left trails of crimson footprints in the snow, turning it to slush. Scouts had returned from the southern valleys. "The trees whisper and bleed," one snarled, his face half dissolved by acid. The winds cry for murder. There is something in the wood that hates the world. Gortek grinned. Then we will feed its skulls until it chokes. But they were not the only ones drawn by the call. To the east, threading through blackened meadows and marshes glistening with unnatural light, came the Obsidian Vow, a warband enthralled to Slaanesh, god of excess, sensation, and exquisite torment. They did not march, they glided, a living pageant of beauty and horror. Armor shimmered with opalescent hues, polished to a mirror's gleam. Masks of silver and ivory covered their faces, each shaped in mockery of mortal expressions, delight, anguish, rapture. Capes flowed behind them like smoke, perfumed with incense that made men hallucinate and weep. At their forefront danced Sylvain the Pale, a prince of pain and ecstasy, their gender shifting with every breath, body limbed in gold. Twin swords curved like fangs rested on their hips. With every step, Sylvain whispered poetry in a dead tongue, and the flowers bloomed black in their wake. The Obsidian Vow did not ride beasts of burden. Their chariots were pulled by mutated creatures, faceless things with too many legs, and skin like stretched velvet. Music followed them, discordant harp strings and the low moan of flutes carved from thigh bones. It infected the air, making the wind dance and the trees tremble. They, too, had heard the forest's call. The scouts who had ventured near Elendel returned changed. One came back naked, eyes rolled back, speaking only in riddles. Another returned with their tongue bitten off, smiling as blood poured down their chest. All described the same vision, a forest writhing, a root of blood, a promise of godhood. Sylvain stood at the edge of a ridge, looking south toward the dense mass of green and rot. The forest has found its rhythm, they said, fingers tracing lazy patterns through the air. Something new is being born within it. Their lieutenant, a towering brute stitched with chains and flesh hooks, spoke. Khorne's dogs moved to claim it. Sylvain's smile was lazy and serene. Let them bark and bite. We will teach the forest how to sing. They advanced at twilight, a slow and decadent wave, leaving trails of corruption in their wake. Trees twisted into obscene sculptures. Animals convulsed and became beautiful abominations, and even the stars above pulsed unnaturally, their light filtered through the lens of chaos. The two warbands were unaware of each other's exact position, but they felt the pull toward the same heart, toward the blooming wound, as Sylvain would later name it, toward the locus where realms bled together. Elendel called to them with a song of old power, of transformation and carnage. And as the brazen claw and the obsidian vow carved their paths toward it, the forest began to respond. The trees thickened, roots grew faster, thorns black as iron sprouted in the dark, blooms opened that wept crimson tears, petals curling like tongues, hungry for the touch of gods and monsters. War was coming, a war not just for territory or dominance, a war for the soul of the forest itself. Chapter 4, The Druid's Warning. Nightfall in Elendel came like a shroud soaked in pitch. The sky above vanished behind a black canopy of twisted limbs, and the stars themselves seemed to blink away in dread. Fires could barely hold flame in this place. Torches hissed and sputtered as if afraid to cast light on what lay ahead. The air was no longer merely foul. It was oppressive, thick as wet wool, heavy with spores and the stink of iron. The Black Antlers made camp beside a ruined stone circle buried deep in the woods. The monoliths had once been etched with druidic runes, but now those markings bled like open wounds, the grooves pulsing faintly with red light. Captain Vorn stood at the edge of the stones, silent, his eyes scanning the dark between the trees. He could feel it. Something watching. Not from any one place, but from everywhere. like the very bark of the forest had grown eyes. Then came the rustle, not the snapping of branches underfoot, nor the slithering of vines, but a rustle like silk dragged over bones. A whisper. Your blades reek of steel, the forest tastes your violence. Half the company raised arms, steel hissing from sheaths, crossbows clicking taut. But the voice did not come from any visible place. It seeped from the darkness. A figure stepped from the shadows. She wore no armor, only a robe of moss and living vines, clinging to a gaunt frame painted in spirals of ochre and ash. Her skin bore calloused welts where thorns had bitten and scars that pulsed with an unnatural glow. Her hair was a mane of tangled roots and leaves, wild and knotted with twigs. Eyes like twin pools of pale green fire peered from her cracked, dirt-streaked face. "I am Melis," she said softly, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "Last of the circle of verdant flame. And if you value breath, you will listen." Born stepped forward. "Speak then, witch, but do it quickly. We've lost too many to shadow and bloom." Melis tilted her head. This place was once sacred. Aelwindle's roots drank deep from the world's life. We sang to it. We bled for it. It grew strong under our guidance. She raised a hand, and the vines on her arm twisted into the shape of a snarling face. But something came from the north. A red wind. A storm of blades. They bled on the sacred groves, killed without reverence, and the forest listened. She paced around the circle, barefoot on the damp soil. It began as rage. It ends in hunger. The spirit of Aelwindle, once a guardian, now a predator. Corn's mark is not burned into trees or carved on stone. It grows from the very wood. He has corrupted the root itself. One of the mercenaries scoffed. "Spirits in the trees? We've got a dozen beasts to ribbons already." Melis's eyes narrowed. Her voice dropped into a rasp. "You fight limbs. The trunk still sleeps." Suddenly she dropped to one knee, driving a jagged bone knife into the soil. The ground trembled. A low groan sounded beneath them, deep and ancient, like a slumbering beast stirring in its bed of earth. Melis spoke now in a tongue none understood, her voice a chant that made the trees shiver. And then a root burst from the ground. Thick as a man's torso, it snaked between them, flinging aside one of the mercenaries. He screamed as the root coiled around his chest, bones crunching, blood leaking from every orifice. The others leapt into action. Swords and axes hacked at the root until it released its victim in a geyser of red and bile. The man was already dead. His skull caved in, eyes wide in terror. Melis stood again, breath ragged. "That was only a tendril," she hissed. "Rootscar, the spirit, sleeps beneath the glade, but it dreams in rage. Every drop of blood wakes it, every death feeds it." Born stared at her, jaw tight. "Why tell us this? Why not let us die like the rest?" Melis looked to the trees, voice barely above a whisper. "Because I have seen what it becomes if it wakes fully." She drew a symbol in the air with her fingers, an eye surrounded by flame, crossed by a bloody branch. It will not remain in Aelwindle. It will grow. Into the empire. Into the mountains. The world will bloom red. She turned to Vorn, stepping close. "You seek gold, glory, answers, but this is no simple curse. This is apotheosis of wrath. Khorne seeks a new avatar, and the forest is his cradle." Vorn said nothing for a long time. Only the wind moved, brushing through armor and skin with a chill like grave breath. Then he spoke. "If what you say is true, then steel won't be enough." Melis smiled for the first time, jagged and bitter. "No, but you must try. Before the glade opens and all things bleed." Above them, the branches creaked. Leaves turned upward, drinking a moon that had turned red, and far beneath their feet something began to pulse. Chapter 5. Blood Rain Falls. The storm rolled in without thunder, without warning. One moment the air was dead and still, the next it was pressing inward, like a clenched fist around the forest's throat. The clouds gathered above Elindo like bruises forming on the sky, purple and red, shot through with veins of black lightning that crawled across the heavens in slow, deliberate cracks. The first drop struck Captain Vaughan's outstretched gauntlet as he stood just beyond the ruined druidic circle. It was warm. Thick, red, light. Another drop followed, then another, and then, as if a vein in the heavens had split wide, it began to pour. The mercenaries stared skyward in stunned horror as crimson rain slicked their armor and matted their hair. It spattered against blades, dripped from helms, and soaked into the ground like hungry ink. The soil sizzled, drinking deep. The trees shuddered, their bark split open in jagged maws that drank the rain like nectar. Melis screamed, clutching her staff. "It begins. You must move. The storm feeds them." Even as she spoke, the forest changed. The branches moved, not swaying but reaching. Bark twisted into limbs that bent with creaks and groans. Vines slithered across the underbrush, coiling like serpents. Blossoms bloomed wide and fast, belching clouds of red spores that choked the air with a coppery sting. Then came the first death. Garrick, one of the younger mercenaries, turned to flee and was yanked off his feet. A vine had shot up and speared clean through his thigh, hauling him backward. He screamed, but it was drowned in the deluge. His sword dropped as the vine pulled him into a tree that opened like a flower. The bark split vertically, revealing a hollow pulsing with raw, fibrous meat. Garrick's scream cut off as he was fed into it, legs first, vanishing with a wet crunch. Blood sprayed from the tree's sides, and it shivered, as if in climax. "Shields," Vaughan bellowed. "Back-to-back formation." The mercenaries grouped into a desperate circle, weapons out, backs pressed together. Around them, the trees advanced, lumbering things of bark and thorn and rage. Some stood 10 feet tall, their limbs long and jagged. Faces were carved into their trunks, skulls fused into the grain, eyes hollow and weeping sap. Others were smaller, spider-like masses of root and vine that skittered between the trees, lunging at ankles and throats. Bren crushed one under her mace with a roar, only to scream as 2 others leapt onto her back, driving needles into her spine. She staggered, fell, and was buried beneath them. Bolts flew, arrows thunked into wood that bled when pierced. Steel clashed against limbs harder than iron, but for each creature they felled, 2 more rose from the wet earth. A tree shattered under a grenade, but from its stump emerged a tangle of roots that lashed like whips, tearing open a soldier's chest and yanking out his heart with a sickening squelch. The blood rain did not relent. It soaked everything, obscuring vision, clogging weapons. The ground turned to red mire, sucking at boots. Cries became distorted howls, echoing off trees that no longer obeyed natural geometry. Paths looped back into themselves. North, south, east, west, meaningless. They were trapped in a labyrinth of hunger. Vaughan fought like a man possessed. His bastard sword, slick with blood, sang through the air. He cleaved one creature from shoulder to groin, splitting it into pulpy halves that steamed on the ground. Another leapt at him, a twisted humanoid mass of moss and bone. He drove a dagger up beneath its jaw and tore sideways, its face peeling open like an orange. "Fall back to the circle," he roared. Only a dozen obeyed. Of the 30 that entered Aelwindel, less than half now remained. The rest were screaming, bleeding, or swallowed. The survivors limped, dragged, and fought their way back toward the stone circle. Melis stood within, chanting in a language older than empire, her body glowing faintly with green fire. Roots lashed at her, but halted just before touching the circle's edge, as if repelled by unseen force. One mercenary didn't make it. A root impaled his stomach and hoisted him into the air. He dangled like a puppet, guts spilling down his legs before the root split into tendrils and peeled him like fruit. Skin tore in wet sheets. His scream became bubbles of blood. Then, silence. Vorn and the others reached the circle. The storm still raged, but within the ancient stones the air felt momentarily still. The rain hissed as it hit the stones, evaporating instantly. Melis slumped, eyes bloodshot, nose bleeding. "It's only begun," she rasped. "The forest has tasted you. It will not stop until all blood flows back to root." Vorn looked out at the slaughter, jaw clenched, fingers tightening around his sword hilt. Around them the trees began to chant, not with words, but with the rustle of leaves, the groan of bark, the slither of roots. A choir of wrath. The forest had awakened, and it was hungry. Chapter 6. The Crimson Grove. The forest grew quieter as the survivors advanced. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but quiet in the way a battlefield falls silent just before the charge. A predatory hush. No birds, no rustling wind. Just the wet squelch of blood-soaked earth beneath their boots and the rasp of strained breath behind cracked helmets. They had lost more than half their number to the storm. Now Vorn led a ragged knot of fighters deeper into Windle's poisoned heart, their bodies coated in clotted gore, armor rusting with dried blood, eyes hollow and vigilant. Melis walked beside him, her staff now glowing with a pulsing green light that sputtered and flickered with every step. The druidess muttered to herself in a tongue no man understood, and Roots moved aside as she passed, not with deference, but wary recognition. The trees thickened, not in number, but in presence. Towering and bloated, their bark throbbed like muscle beneath diseased skin. Veins bulged across trunks, some twitching visibly. And the smell, gods, the smell, like a slaughterhouse left to rot in the sun. Sweet and fetid, blood and feces, flowers and decay. Then they saw it, the Crimson Grove. It opened before them like a wound in the land, a circular clearing ringed by trees that had fused together, their trunks twisted into grotesque arches. Each bore hundreds of skulls, human, beast, and unnameable, growing like fruit. Some were fresh, flesh still clinging, others were bleached white and fused directly into the bark, mouths frozen in silent screams. Gorn raised a hand and the company halted. The air in the grove was thick, dense. Breathing felt like inhaling syrup laced with iron and heat. The ground was not soil, but meat, dark red and pulsing beneath their boots like the surface of a living heart. Steam rose in slow curls from cracks in the fleshy turf, carrying whispers in every plume. Words half-formed, pleasure, pleasure, vengeance. And at the center of it all, the portal. It hovered a foot above the ground, a spiraling gash in reality itself, a tear in the skin of the world. Around it the very air shimmered, bending light like heat on metal. Its edges were raw and jagged, bleeding strands of shadow and red lightning that lashed out sporadically. When it pulsed, the ground trembled. Each pulse grew stronger, closer, hungrier. Melis gasped, falling to her knees. "It is not yet whole," she hissed, "but it wants to be." The trees groaned. A figure emerged from the grove. It was not a man. Towering, hunched, clad in layered bark and bone, it stood 8 feet tall and dragged behind it a rusted flail crowned with a cluster of still-living heads. Its face was a tangle of antlers and exposed muscle, with one single eye glaring red-hot in the center of its chest. The creature knelt before the portal and howled, a sound that made ears bleed and teeth ache. 2 more followed, then 4, then a dozen. Creatures born of the forest, molded by Khorne's rage, half daemon, half wood, all wrath. Some bore axes fused to their limbs. Others had no mouths, only gaping wounds that vented steam and curses. They gathered in silent reverence, watching the portal throb like a birthing womb. "Blood for the root," Melis whispered. "They feed it, every death, every drop spilled." One of the mercenaries broke ranks and fired. The bolts thunked into the nearest creature's chest. It looked down at the shaft sticking from its flesh. Then it charged. The grove exploded into chaos. Vorn roared, drawing steel, meeting the creature head-on. His sword clashed against the flail, sparks flying. The beast screamed in his face, hot blood spattering his visor, and swung. Vorn ducked and drove his blade into its gut. The thing grabbed the sword, pulled it deeper, and laughed before collapsing in steaming ruin. The others attacked from all sides. Bren, her armor cracked and her mace broken, tackled a beast twice her size, and tore its jaw off with her bare hands before being eviscerated by a root that burst from the ground and impaled her through the spine. Another soldier was grabbed by 2 creatures and ripped apart, legs and torso separating with a wet pop. Melis screamed incantations, summoning thorn-covered vines to lash out, dragging 2 daemons into the earth, but one reached her and smashed her into the ground with a backhand blow. Bones cracked and she spat blood, crawling away. Vorn fought like a man possessed. He severed limbs, cleaved skulls, and kicked a screaming monster into the portal itself. It was sucked in with a shriek, twisting and folding until it vanished in a spray of fire. But for every monster felled, another emerged. And the portal kept growing. It pulsed now in rhythm with the grove's heartbeat. A red storm coiled above it, churning with symbols and faces. The trees bowed inward, as if in worship. And from the portal's core, something moved. Not yet through, but close. Born grabbed Melis, hoisting her to her feet. "How do we close it?" he demanded. Her eyes were glassy. She coughed, blood bubbling from her lips. "You can't," she whispered. "Not yet. But you can survive, and watch, and wait." Wait for what? For it to be born. The grove shrieked, and the crimson portal opened wider. Chapter 7. Warbands collide. The brazen claw did not sneak into the forest. They marched, every footfall a challenge, every beat of their brass drums a declaration of dominance. Where they passed, the ground smoked under boot and hoof, and the air grew hot and thick with the iron tang of promised blood. Khorne sigils had been carved into their flesh and armor, fresh and festering. Red light glowed from beneath their helms, and their breath came in rasps like bellows feeding a forge. They had come to claim the heart of Elwindle, and they did not come quietly. At the edge of the Crimson Grove, Gorthak's skull-render stood, arms bare, muscles slick with blood, not his own, and eyes like burning coals beneath a horned helm. Before him, a trio of his warp-prests dragged a shrieking cultist forward, bound in chains etched with runes of fury. "Do not ask," Gorchak bellowed to the grove. "He takes." The cultist was forced to their knees before the portal. The war-priests began their chant, low, guttural syllables that ground against the world like the sharpening of axes. They raised curved knives, forged from demon steel and never washed. With a synchronized motion, they plunged the blades into the cultist's chest. The scream that followed was not human. It spiraled upward, as if the soul were being unraveled, thread by agonizing thread. The blood was not red, but black and steaming, thick as tar. It poured onto the living ground, and the grove shuddered. The skull fruit on the trees began to rattle, their jaws snapping open and shut. The roots drank. The portal pulsed. Wider. Hungrier. But Khorne's blood ritual was not to go unchallenged. The obsidian vow had arrived. They moved through the forest like perfume through silk, silent, sensuous, lethal. Sylvain the Pale watched from a ridge just beyond the grove, their face half concealed by a porcelain mask shaped in rapturous agony. A delicate smile curved their painted lips. "Dutch noise," Sylvain murmured, stroking the hilt of one of their twin blades. "Do they think the forest sings for them alone?" The answer came in the form of violence. At their signal, the obsidian vow descended like smoke and silk-clad death. Chariots pulled by bladed beasts crashed through the underbrush. Archers with filigreed bows loosed volleys of venom-tipped arrows, and the masked warriors fell upon the brazen claw with a terrible grace. The first to fall was a warprast, struck by a bolt that sizzled on contact, eating through his face in a cascade of melting flesh and bone. Another was impaled by a spear so slender it seemed more like a needle, yet it split his chest like wet parchment. Gorthak roared and charged. His axe, more cleaver than blade, met the first vow warrior mid-lunge. The strike split the androgynous figure from clavicle to hip, viscera spilling out like flowering ribbons. Another foe came with twin daggers, flashing, carving through the air in a blur of artistry. Gorthak caught one wrist mid-swing, twisted, and ripped the arm clean from its socket, beating the dying figure to the ground with it. But Slaanesh followers did not bleed or die like mortals. For every strike that felled one, two more danced behind, beautiful and terrible. Their laughter echoed across the grove, haunting and alluring, even as the ground turned into a churning morass of gore and fire. The brazen claw fought back with feral fury. Their numbers formed a crimson tide, blades flashing, bodies colliding in brutal impact. They fought with no finesse, only rage, raw and unrelenting. Shields shattered, flesh was cleaved from bone. One berserker took a blade through the gut, laughed, and headbutted his killer so hard that the mask shattered and bone caved in. The corrupted forest responded. Roots thrashed underfoot. The trees wailed in ecstasy and agony. Blossoms exploded with clouds of soporific gas, dulling senses and dragging screams into moans. Some warriors dropped their weapons, eyes dilated, bodies racked by convulsions of pleasure and pain as they succumbed to the forest's intoxication. Above it all, the portal blazed, no longer a wound, but a gaping mouth of red light. From it, tendrils of raw chaos reached into the grove, grabbing corpses and feeding on them. One tendril seized a dying brazen claw warrior and peeled his skin off in a single motion before devouring him whole. In the center of it all, Gorthak and Sylvain met. Steel kissed steel. Gorthak's axe shattered the earth with every blow, carving trenches of fire and broken bodies. Sylvain dodged with impossible fluidity, blades flashing like moonlight on oil. Sparks flew, blood danced. One swing of the axe sheared off part of Sylvain's shoulder. A slash of their blade left a glowing wound across Gorthak's chest that bled light. Their battle was a dance of extremes, brute force against sublime speed, wrath against seduction. Around them, the Warbands tore into each other with unholy fervor. One brazen claw warrior tore open his own belly to hurl entrails at a vow sorcerer, who caught them midair and transformed the viscera into a swarm of shrieking bloodflies. Another was embraced by a demonette masquerading as a woman, who kissed him before pulling out his tongue and sliding it down her throat like a delicacy. When the sun rose, if it could still be called that, nothing remained of the grove but ash, blood, and bone. The trees wept gore. The portal pulsed wider, but neither warband would retreat. The battle had not ended. It had only begun. Chapter 8. the horned glade. They trudged through death. The remnants of Vorn's company, less than 10 now, moved like shades through the rotting bowels of Aelwindle. Blood coated everything. Their armor was stiff with it, their faces pale beneath dried smears, their eyes too tired to weep. Behind them, the crimson grove still echoed with the howls of the damned, war cries and death moans, steel on bone, pleasure-twisted shrieks, mingling with the roar of flame. But ahead there was something else, something different. Melis led them through a narrow trail, half swallowed by root and moss. Her staff glowed a faint, steady green, casting light that seemed to repel the creeping corruption that blanketed most of the forest. The air here was cooler, cleaner, but tense, as if the trees were holding their breath. "Beastway," she said, voice hoarse but resolute. "We're near the horned glade, the last place untouched, the last place it hasn't claimed." Vorn followed silently, sword resting against his shoulder, eyes scanning every shadow. He had no illusions of safety, only a brief reprieve before the next slaughter. They passed under a twisted arch formed by 2 living trees grown together, their trunks knotted in a perfect spiral. Vines hung like drapes. As they crossed, each soldier felt a pressure ease. Like the forest's breath no longer carried murder in every exhale. The horned glade opened before them like a buried memory. It was smaller than they expected, no more than 30 paces across. But here the forest was different. Trees rose tall and proud, untouched by rot or mutation. Their bark was silver, gray, their leaves golden and gently rustling despite the still air. In the center stood a great stag-shaped stone idol, half swallowed by moss, with emeralds for eyes that pulsed softly with ancient life. Beneath it, the grass grew thick and vibrant. Small white flowers, none of them red, sprouted in gentle rings. A faint glow hovered over the clearing, a green mist that smelled of pine and blooming things. Even the blood that stained the mercenaries seemed to dull, drying into flakes that crumbled from their skin like dust. Melis collapsed to her knees before the statue. "This was its heart," she whispered. "Here the spirit dwelled, not in rage, not in blood, but in balance." Vorn stepped closer, lowering his sword. "You said it was a guardian." Melis nodded. "Aelwindle was alive long before the Empire raised stone walls. This spirit, it was wrathful, yes, as nature often is, but bound by cycles, growth and decay, hunt and rebirth. We druids kept the pact. We fed it with sacrifice, but never wanton blood." She looked up, tears streaking her dirt-streaked cheeks. But the storm came. Khorne's worshippers, they bled too much. They defiled the roots with battle and slaughter, and the spirit changed. It cracked beneath the weight of their hate. She stood, weakly, and gestured to the stone stag. "I brought you here because this place is still sacred, still pure. The wards hold because they were carved with truth, but they won't hold forever." As if summoned by her words, the glade shivered. The golden leaves quivered, the wind moaned low and long, and the green mist trembled. One of the mercenaries, Lauren, a quiet man with half a face burnt away, stepped toward the edge of the clearing. The moment his boot left the glade's boundary, a thorned root burst from the ground and speared through his chest. Blood sprayed in an arc as his body convulsed, then was dragged screaming into the shadows beyond. The others raised weapons, but saw only his shredded corpse vanishing beneath the underbrush, still twitching. Melis cried out, "Stay within the stones! It waits outside!" She ran to the boundary and thrust her staff into the ground. Green fire blazed, forming a circle of light that pushed the corruption back momentarily. Vorn gritted his teeth. "You said this was safe." "I said it was protected," Melis hissed. But the spirit Rootscar now, it senses you. You've spilled too much blood in the forest. It sees you as kindling. If not for the wards, it would have torn you all apart. He glanced at the statue. And what of the spirit? The real one? Is it gone? No, she said softly. It's still in there, beneath the bark and blood. Somewhere. It screams in silence, bound by Khorne's will, twisted by his rage. But if we find a way to reach it... She touched the stag's chest. It beat faintly, like a dying heart. We can remind it of what it was. The ground outside trembled. Low, rhythmic thuds echoed in the distance, massive footfalls, far too slow and deliberate to be human. A shriek rose high and unbroken, a daemon's call of ecstasy and pain. The warbands were still battling in the grove, but the forest no longer needed them. The corruption was coming on its own now. Melis looked to Vorn, her voice low. If Rootscar reaches this place, the last light of Elwindel dies, and there will be no stopping the bloom, not with fire, not with gods, only death. Vorn looked back at the golden leaves, the silent statue, the flickering light. Then we hold it here, he said. He drove his sword into the earth, and the trees trembled in answer. Chapter 9. Khorne's Bloom. Elwindel no longer breathed like a forest. It seethed. The transformation had accelerated. What was once corruption spreading like infection had now become full metamorphosis. The forest was becoming something else, something monstrous, something sacred in its desecration. It began with the animals. Deer, once gentle and timid, now bore antlers of rusted iron, jagged and serrated, grown like weapons. Their eyes burned red, and their hooves cracked the earth as they charged through the trees, impaling whatever moved. Foxes swelled into sinewy, many-limbed horrors, their mouths splitting open into vertical maws ringed with yellow fangs. Birds no longer flew, they shrieked, flapping torn wings and dropping sharpened bones like darts from the canopy. Wolves had become something else entirely. Their flesh peeled back along their spines, exposing rib cages filled with pulsating tongues. Their growls were words now, guttural chants in blood-soaked Khazalid and forgotten tribal curses. They no longer hunted to feed, they hunted to slaughter. And the trees, gods the trees. They moved not by wind, but by will. Roots tore free from the ground, acting as legs. Branches bent inward and downward, snapping and reshaping into jagged claws. Their trunks split open vertically to reveal burning cores of ember and blood. Some bore faces, human, elven, beast, and all screamed silently from bark petrified in anguish. Moss turned to hair, leaves rusted to scales. Thorns burst from every limb. Elwindel was not a forest anymore. It was a war engine. Khorne's bloom had taken root, and the very ground became a proving ground for wrath. The soil itself pulsed like muscle. Footsteps sank into it, not with crunch but squish, a wet sucking noise like walking across a field of tongues. Pools of blood formed in perfect circles, never evaporating, never seeping. In some places bones jutted from the earth like spears, sharpened and arranged into sigils that shimmered in red light. The sky above was perpetually crimson, not with sunlight, but with clouds of coagulated mist that rained not water, but warm gore. Not a drop, not a drizzle, showers of blood fell at intervals, soaking the trees, dyeing everything a glistening scarlet. Steam rose from the soaked ground, laced with spores that sent those who inhaled them into raving frenzies. Even time seemed to warp. Night and day no longer followed rhythm or reason. Dusk bled into dawn and back again within minutes. Shadows moved with purpose. Echoes repeated sounds that were never made. The survivors of the Brazen Claw and the Obsidian Vow, scattered and maddened, were devoured by the forest they once sought to claim. One war priest of Khorne had attempted to anoint a new altar, a felled tree stump carved into a crude throne. As he chanted, his flesh split open from within, ribs pushing outward as if something beneath his skin demanded freedom. He collapsed, screaming, as his torso blossomed, literally, into a massive red flower, petals formed from sinew, teeth for pistols. The bloom sucked his corpse inward, devouring every drop. A demonette, caught in one of the bloom traps, laughed as vines pierced her flesh, but her mirth turned to panic as the vines took root inside her, splitting her apart into blossoming vines made of nerve and muscle. She became a tree before she finished dying. Nothing was safe. Even the earth beneath battlefields erupted in spasms. Great geysers of hot blood blasted into the air, raining back down with chunks of bone. The forest's floor split open like wounds, valleys yawning wide, exposing vast chambers below filled with writhing roots and eyes that blinked without eyelids, eyes that watched, judged, hungered. The central grove, the birthplace of the bloom, now towered with a new structure. A tree, but not a tree. It rose over 80 feet into the air, composed entirely of fused bodies, bone and bark. It screamed with every breath of wind. Arms dangled from its boughs like fruit. Its roots were veins, pulsing and pumping crimson sap into the land. This was Rootscar's body, its avatar, still growing, still becoming. And at its base, the portal widened, no longer a wound, but a maw. Through it, visions flickered. A plain of skulls, a sky made of iron, rivers of lava where brass ships sailed and fired cannons of skulls into mountains made of screaming faces. The realm of chaos beckoned. Khorne's bloom was not simply a corruption. It was a bridge. And now the forest did not merely thirst for blood. It demanded it. Chapter 10. Vows and Vengeance. Even among the depraved, vanity breeds rebellion. Deep within the blood-choked labyrinth of Elendil, where vines coiled like serpents and trees moaned in endless ecstasy or agony, a splintered faction of the Obsidian Vow gathered beneath a pavilion of glistening, pulsating flesh, stretched like silk over living bone. Here, among the warped groves where Slaanesh's taint still whispered, they dared what their war leader would not. They sought to summon a keeper of secrets. Led by Valzera the Perfumed, a former concubine priestess turned war sorcerer, the group was a mélange of mutilated elegance. Warriors adorned in chain-woven silk soaked with blood, faces covered by gem-inlaid masks carved into rictus grins, their blades curved like predatory smiles. They moved with purpose, steps synchronized to a music only they could hear. "The blood god's seed grows rampant," Valzera declared to her followers, voice wet with honey and venom. "Khorne's savagery consumes our paradise of sensation. He drowns the forest in noise. But we will remind the roots of music." They formed a circle around an ancient oak, long dead, hollowed and twisted into a spiral of gnarled branches. Its bark was flayed in long strips, revealing veins that pulsed with dark iridescence. Carved runes of lust, ambition, and forbidden knowledge lined its base, each rune burning with a shifting spectrum of color. A prisoner was dragged forth, one of the Brazen Claw, chained and gagged, his limbs severed below the elbows and knees to ensure compliance. His flesh was carved with sacrificial glyphs, each wound deliberately shaped to draw out agony. They laid him in the center, splayed like a grotesque flower, and began the ritual. Valzera raised a dagger of glass that vibrated with unnatural tension. With a single motion she plunged it into the warrior's chest, twisting. Blood poured, not red but violet, steaming with perfume so thick it made the acolytes moan and sway. They chanted. The ground beneath them shimmered. Reality bent inward. The air thickened, colored like oil over water. Shadows moved without source. Sounds twisted. Moans became music. Cries became laughter. Pleasure and terror blurred. The portal began to form. Not like Khorne's crude rift, a wound torn by rage, but a perfect spiral of light and silk, a mirror into the realm of excess. They could see it, the shifting palace of Slaanesh, the great banquet of flesh and sin, the fluting lullabies of eternal temptation. Then something went wrong. The brazen claw warrior, meant to die in moaning ecstasy, laughed. Not a scream, a laugh, deep, defiant, guttural. In that moment, Khorne's mark, carved deep into his chest, blazed crimson. His soul, bound in fury, refused to be sacrificed to his rival. The portal screamed. It rippled outward like a soap bubble bursting. And everything fell apart. Belsera's acolytes were the first to suffer. One's head imploded, eyes sucked into the skull before it collapsed in on itself. Another's body bent backward at impossible angles, each bone breaking like glass under pressure, until she was snapped in half like a ribbon. The portal tore instead of opened. From it something emerged, but not a keeper of secrets. Not wholly. What stepped out was malformed, a creature caught between desires and wrath. Its body was lithe and elegant, but its flesh peeled and sloughed in bloody sheets. One arm ended in delicate fingers, the other was a crushing pincer fused with brass. Its face was split down the middle, half a smooth, beautiful mask, the other a gaping, roaring maw filled with bone hooks. It screamed, a sound that made the grove split. Not in reverence, in pain. It fell to its knees, clawing at its face, ripping chunks of its own skull free. Every movement tore reality around it. Trees bled, rocks melted, flowers exploded in showers of gore. Belsera backed away, face twisted in confusion and fear. This is not what we called. The hybrid demon locked its malformed eyes on her and charged. She barely raised her blade before it impaled her on its pincer, lifting her high. The claw squeezed and her rib cage exploded in a spray of jewel-bright organs. Her screams were cut short as the demon devoured her in 2 bites, sucking the rest of her torso into its twisting gut. The survivors fled, but the forest would not allow it. Roots, once dormant, now responded to the birth of this new corruption. They snatched fleeing figures, pulled them underground. One acolyte was split from groin to neck by vines, her remains dragged into a tree that wept for hours afterward. The creature, still screaming, began to wander, each step unraveling reality further. It bled from its eyes. Its laughter became static. Its voice called out for its creator, but no god answered. The ritual had failed. But the damage was done. The demon, neither of Slaanesh nor Khorne, but an abomination born of both, was loose in Aelwindel, and madness followed in its wake. Chapter 11. The root mind awakens. The forest stopped breathing. For a brief, chilling moment in the corrupted heart of Aelwindel, all things stilled. The trees no longer groaned. The vines ceased their slithering, and the bloody rain paused mid-fall, hanging in the air like frozen rubies. Even the screams, constant now, a grim chorus since the battle began, faded to silence. Then the earth moved. Not a tremble, not a quake. It heaved, like lungs drawing their first breath after drowning. The center of the crimson grove, now little more than a festering pit of gore and shattered bone, ruptured. A geyser of black-red sap exploded skyward, spraying the canopy with clotted filth. The trees bent away, bowing or breaking under the force, and a hole tore open in the forest floor, not downward, but inward, as though reality itself were being dragged into the womb of something abominable. From the chasm it emerged. Rootscar, the spirit of Aelwindle, once protector and soul of the woods, now reborn as a monstrous hybrid of daemon and deity. Khorne's corruption had not just infected the forest, it had merged with its essence, giving birth to something that had no place in either the natural world or the realm of chaos. It rose from the earth like a god, being vomited from the veins of the world. Its body was titanic, a walking cathedral of bark, bone, and muscle, easily 20 feet tall and still growing. Its limbs were gnarled branches fused with sinew and armored in plates of chitinous bark, each finger a scything root tipped with obsidian claws. Vines whipped from its shoulders like tentacles, covered in screaming mouths, faces, thousands of them pushed against the surface of its trunk-like torso, contorted in agony, laughter, and blind rage. Its head was a warped crown of antlers, twisted into jagged horns soaked in blood. Beneath it, where a face should have been, was a chasm of fire and screaming, an endless maw from which a never-ceasing wail emerged, the voice of the forest, of all who had died within it, of the soul of nature now possessed by rage. At its center burned a pulsing eye, massive, lidless, and red as boiling blood, set within its chest like a heart that could see. This was not merely a demon. This was an apotheosis. Rootscar roared, and the ground cracked for miles. The sky turned the color of a bruised corpse. Trees for leagues around burst into spontaneous bloom, spraying pollen that corroded steel and flesh alike. It moved. Every step was a slaughter. Vines dragged up the dead, both brazen claw and obsidian vow, and wove them into its body. It absorbed them, fused their bones to its flanks, their weapons to its arms. It grew with every kill, its voice becoming deeper, more articulate. Make sense? All bleed, all feed, all root. It no longer hunted. It consumed. The remnants of the warbands, broken and scattered, attempted resistance. One champion of Khorne hurled himself at the abomination, bellowing praises to the blood god. Rootscar's vines met him mid-charge, lifting him into the air and flaying him alive in an instant, his blood siphoned, his skull stripped and embedded into the creature's shoulder like a trophy. Another, one of the obsidian vow, whispered a forbidden word and detonated herself in a blossom of pain and light. The explosion tore bark from Rootscar's flank, but from the wound spilled not sap, but teeth. Thousands of tiny shrieking fangs that scuttled back into its body and healed it. Melis, watching from the horn glade, fell to her knees, her eyes flooded with tears and horror. "It was never supposed to wait," she rasped. We bound it with life. Now it is bound by blood." Vorn stood beside her, gripping his sword with white-knuckled hands. "How do we kill it?" "You don't," she said. "Not with steel, not anymore. It seeks to ascend, to become a daemon prince, a god of this plane. If it consumes both warbands, if it completes the bloom, it will—" As if hearing her, Rootscar paused its march and turned its burning eye toward the glade. The ground beneath them throbbed. Then it spoke, its voice a blend of forest creek, screaming souls, and Khorne's eternal wrath. Using? I am. Roots exploded from the ground, seeking blood, and the forest, fully awakened, began to march with it. Chapter 12. Fractured Alliances. They met beneath a dead moon, its crimson light fractured by the thick canopy of twisted limbs above, casting the horned glade in streaks of blood and shadow. Rootscar's bellows still echoed across Aelwindel, an unrelenting dirge of hunger and godhood. The ground pulsed with his every movement. Time itself felt bruised. Captain Elar Vorn stood at the edge of the sacred boundary, sword drawn but lowered, watching the tree line with wary eyes. His face was smeared with soot and dried blood. His armor bore deep gashes from previous battles, and his right pauldron had been ripped clean off. Around him, what remained of the black antlers formed a grim semicircle, weapons ready, but exhausted beyond fear. Then the survivors came. First, from the brazen claw, a small knot of warriors bearing more wounds than armor, their red paint faded, faces slack from exhaustion, madness smoldering just beneath the surface. At their front strode Karn bloodbound, a colossus of a man with a shattered helmet still clinging to half his skull. His left arm was gone below the elbow, replaced by a hooked blade bound with iron and sinew. Behind them emerged a shimmer of silk and shadow, what was left of the obsidian vow. No more than 7, faces obscured by cracked masks and torn veils, their elegance stained by the violence of recent days. Their leader now was Issa the Hollow, whose voice was known to cause madness in mortal men. Her beauty was untouched, yet her left eye was gone, and in its place a polished gem swirled with unnatural color. Tension crackled like a taut wire. Vorn raised his voice. "I should kill all of you where you stand." Karn chuckled, low and broken. "Try. We die with axes in our hands, Captain. How will you go, screaming as the trees suck your bones dry?" Yissa smiled without warmth. "Perhaps we should skip the barking. Rootscar is growing. Every minute we waste it feeds." Melis emerged from behind Vorn, leaning on her staff, her breath shallow. "He's right," she said. "The forest walks now. The glade is the only place it cannot yet reach, but it will, and soon." Karn spat a gob of blood to the ground. "Why speak with them?" He gestured to Issa and her ilk. "Slaves to sensation. Their knives bleed beauty while we bleed war." Nisa tilted her head. "And yet both your gods lie silent, don't they? Neither Khorne nor Slaanesh have lifted a claw to stop what's happening." "Because Rootscar is new, a creature of this world, bound to the old gods, yes, but not of them. It will not share this place." Vorn sheathed his sword with a slow motion, his voice cold as frostbitten steel. "Then we stop it. Together." The word "together" fell into silence like a corpse into a pond. Melis laid out the truth in jagged words. Rootscar fed on violence, consumed souls through slaughter, and sought not just to become a daemon prince, but a fixed deity, a presence anchored to the mortal world. The portal had become its cradle. The Warbands had only hastened the birth. Now it had form, mind, and will, and unless it was stopped, it would grow beyond their ability to contain it. An uneasy agreement was forged that night. Oren's mercenaries would strike the core. Melis believed the still-beating eye in Rootscar's chest was a vestige of the true forest spirit, bound in torment. If they could damage it, they might weaken or slow the bloom. Karn's bloodthirsty remnants would draw Rootscar's attention, using their rage to distract and mislead it from the glade. Yissa and her sorcerers would use their remaining enchantments to confuse and obscure their approach, blinding Rootscar to their movements for as long as possible. But unity born of desperation is brittle. The cracks began immediately. One of Karn's men tried to kill Yissa in her sleep, cutting her throat ear to ear. She survived only because the wound opened a hidden mouth that screamed a hex of flaying energy, reducing the attacker to ribbons of spinning flesh. Vorn executed one of his own who tried to abandon the pact, dragging the weeping man back into camp and putting a blade through his throat before the others. And Issa, smiling as always, whispered to her followers that the eye within, Rootscar, might hold a spark of divinity, something she would claim for herself if it could be extracted intact. But for now, they fought side by side. The fractured alliance marched into the crimson-lit forest like a funeral procession. Each warrior knew they might die. Many expected betrayal. But all agreed on one truth: Rootscar must not live. Chapter 13. Blades in Bloom. The sun never rose. As the midsummer solstice approached, light in Aelwindel ceased to come from the heavens. It now bled from the trees, from the flowers, from the very soil. A vermilion luminescence bathed the world in a feverish hue, neither day nor night, but an eternal dusk, pulsing with malignant intent. The forest had become a maze of living war. Paths twisted unnaturally, branches rearranged themselves behind travelers, roots grew and retracted with sudden hunger. The trees no longer merely watched, they acted. Entire groves uprooted and repositioned themselves. Vines reached out with surgical speed, impaling birds in flight and dragging them into blossoming maws. Every plant, every bloom, every blade of grass was a weapon, a part of Rootscar's ever-expanding body. And amidst this horror, the ritual sites bloomed. They emerged like boils across the forest skin. Clearings opened in symmetrical circles, ringed by trees that wept blood from gnarled faces, their branches woven into arches and crucifixes. At their centers stood altars, though no two were the same. One was a pulsing mound of intestines that quivered when approached. Another was a pyre of fused skulls, burning with blue fire despite lacking fuel. Others were more grotesque. Pits of writhing limbs, or statues shaped from still-living torsos, mouths agape in eternal prayer to a god no sane man could name. Each site marked a node in Rootscar's growing lattice, a web of power laced through the forest-like veins. Melis explained as they passed one. These are more than shrines. They're organs, feeding the bloom, linking the forest's will. Vorn didn't reply. He only nodded to Karn, who hacked down a twisted tree nearby. As the blade split the trunk, a torrent of maggots and steaming blood sprayed outward, drenching them all. The tree screamed as it died, a sound like a child wailing through shattered glass. Nisa, wiping her mask clean, chuckled softly. Even in death it sings. Their path was one of attrition. Every step forward cost blood. Ambushes became constant. Creatures no longer waited in hiding. They attacked openly, bold in Rootscar's rising dominion. A malformed elk the size of a house rammed through their ranks, antlers tipped with daemonic runes, its belly a transparent membrane revealing screaming human faces pressed against the skin. It gored 2 mercenaries before Karn crushed its skull with a flanged hammer, splitting its brains across 10 feet of moss. Another time they encountered a pool that reflected not their faces but their deaths. One of Issa's warlocks fell into trance, whispering his own demise aloud until his body crumbled into dust and was sucked into the water. The pool rippled and grew larger. The solstice drew closer, and with it the forest bloomed in earnest. Flowers now dominated the terrain, massive alien things with petals like muscle and stamen-like teeth. They opened and closed in time with Rootscar's breath, exhaling pheromones that made men hallucinate or frenzy. Some saw their gods. Others saw their own mothers, weeping. One man screamed and tore his own eyes out, shouting that he saw the forest as it truly was. Born had Melis burn those fields with blessed fire. The flames screamed as they consumed the flora, and the flowers bled white pus and bile, their death spasms violent and convulsive. Trees wept ash for hours afterward. At dusk, if it could be called that, they reached the center of one particularly vast ritual site. It was shaped like a rose, its petals formed from thousands of interwoven corpses, stitched together at the muscle. The flower pulsed gently, inhaling and exhaling the stench of rotting flesh and clotted blood. At its heart lay a basin, a bowl grown from ivory bone, filled with a dark liquid thicker than pitch. A single voice called out from it. Not screamed, not chanted, whispered. Each warrior heard it in their native tongue. It promised power, vengeance, ecstasy, purpose. Issa took one step forward before Vorn's blade was at her throat. "Drink it," he said coldly, "and I kill you before you swallow." Issa smiled, stepping back. "But if it made me more useful?" "It won't. It'll make you theirs." They moved on, burning the basin behind them. But even as they left, each man and woman in the Alliance felt the voice linger behind their thoughts. The solstice was hours away, and the bloom was almost in full flower. Chapter 14. The Heart of Rot. They came to it at the edge of sanity. After hours wading through blood-slicked mud, slashing through thickets of bone-thorn, and surviving another ambush by Rootscar's walking trees, now fully armored in fused iron and bark, the ragged company stumbled upon a hollow unlike anything they had seen. It was alive. The clearing opened like a wound torn into the world's crust. Not a grove, not a pit, but a gaping crater, black and red and steaming. It pulsed. The air shimmered with heat and the heavy stink of rot, like a battlefield left untended for weeks. In the center rose a great monolith, taller than a fortress tower, jagged and fractured, its surface webbed with glowing crimson veins. The world root shard. Vorn felt its pull immediately. So did everyone. It was not a gentle sensation, nor seductive like Slanish's temptations. It dragged at the soul like a butcher's hook behind the sternum. Every wound ached, every scar burned, memories flooded, unbidden. Every failure, every cruelty committed or endured, brought screaming to the surface of the mind. The shard was corrupted. What had once been a pillar of natural harmony, binding the ley lines and spiritual arteries of Aelwindel into a network of balance and growth, was now choked with rage. Its surface was no longer pure crystal, but crusted with scabrous layers of infected bark and coagulated blood. Vines writhed across it like veins over an infected heart. Inside its fractured surface, one could see movement. Faces, perhaps, or lost spirits, trapped and screaming in its core. Melis fell to her knees as soon as she beheld it. Tears poured freely from her eyes, black with despair. She dug her hands into the blood-drenched soil and chanted a low, tremulous prayer in the language of the old gods. "This is where it began," she rasped. "The first wound. When Khorne's warpriests bled their enemies upon sacred roots, when no voice rose to stop them, the spirit of Awindel was here. It is here, trapped, twisted." Vorn stepped forward, staring into the shard. He saw his reflection not as he was, but as he might become. A wretched lord of violence, crowned in skulls, flesh scoured by fire. His men little more than husks, that followed him in silent, obedient death. He stepped back. "This is Rootscar's heart," he said. "Isn't it?" Melis nodded. "Not just the heart of Rootscar, the heart of the forest. If we cleanse it, truly purify it, we sever its link to the bloom. Rootscar's form collapses. Its power dies." Karn scoffed, arms crossed, face pale. "Cleanse that? It's a bloody mountain of hate. You'd need a god's fire to scrub it clean." Melis whispered, "Just a soul." They turned to her as if she had struck them. "Fallen?" Vorn asked, though he already knew. Melis rose slowly, blood clinging to her palms, her eyes glowing faintly green. The world root responds to sacrifice, not one of death, one of life, of will, of spirit freely given, not torn or forced. The shard must be fed a soul of meaning, something strong enough to overwhelm Rootscar's dominion. Issa laughed behind her broken mask. Then it's suicide. You expect one of us to offer ourselves? I'll do it, Karn growled suddenly, surprising them all. Korn wants blood. He can have all of mine. I'll go into that thing screaming and it'll choke on my rage. Melis shook her head. No. You hate. You burn. That feeds it. The sacrifice must be opposite. Must remember what the forest was. You can't be corrupted. Silence fell. Then Vorn stepped forward. Then it's me. Melis's mouth opened in protest, but he raised a hand. I've killed more than I remember. I've watched friends die, and I never stopped fighting. But not for gods, not for glory, for survival. That matters. I remember what we were before this forest cursed us. If I can carry that into the heart, maybe it'll listen. Or maybe it'll tear you apart, Korn muttered. Vorn smiled grimly. Then I hope it's fast. Melis drew a circle in the blood-caked soil and began to chant. The shard groaned in response, its surface splitting wider. The faces inside screamed louder, reaching out. Vorn stepped into the circle, his skin already blistering as the shard's influence peeled away layers of guilt, sin, and pain like burning wind. Melis pressed a dagger into his hand. Only one way to offer a soul. He nodded, stepped forward, toward the shard, each footfall shaking the ground. Vines lashed at him. The air turned to fire. The pressure mounted. He turned once to look back at the others. Then he plunged the blade into his own heart. The explosion was soundless. A shock wave of light, not golden, not green, but a blinding white, burst from the shard, disintegrating vines, bark, and corruption in a radius. The crimson veins burned away. The screaming faces faded. The shard cracked, and then sang. A clear, resonant tone like a bell tolling for the damned. Then came the silence. And then Rootscar screamed. Miles away, the monster staggered. The bloom shuddered. And for the first time the forest knew fear. Chapter 15. The Betrayer's Path. The silence that followed Vorn's sacrifice was not peace. It was the hush before a hurricane. The forest stilled, yes, and Rootscar's scream had echoed across the rotting miles like the cry of a wounded god. But the bloom did not die. It trembled, it recoiled, and, most dangerously, it adapted. The heart of the forest had been pierced, the world root shard partially cleansed, but Rootscar still lived, weakened, wounded, and aware. The company gathered in the glade where Vorn had given his life. Melis stood at the center, her once filthy robes now laced with radiant threads of green, residue of the purified shard. Her eyes glowed like stars beneath a canopy of skeletal trees. Mech-Aver gave us a chance, she whispered. One moment, one strike. The remnants of the alliance, what little remained, tightened around her. Karn's eyes were hollow. Yissa stood silent, her mask off, face unreadable. They had survived countless horrors together, bound by little more than necessity and the promise of vengeance. Now, with Vorn gone, they faced the maw of Rootscar, leaderless. Or so they thought. It was Redithron who stepped forward. Once a lieutenant under Vorn, Thorn had been quiet since the death of their captain. A lean man with dead eyes and a voice like gravel over frost, he had served in the Black Antlers for years, surviving every massacre and slaughter by sheer cruelty and luck. Now he stood taller. His armor gleamed, not polished but blood-slick, fresh. His eyes glowed faintly red, not from firelight, but from within. "I've seen the truth," he said flatly. "We've spent too long resisting. Vorn died for a sliver of hope. But we don't need hope. We need power." The group turned to him. Karn narrowed his eyes. Yissa tilted her head. "What are you saying?" Melis asked. Thorn unlatched the clasp at his throat and removed his cuirass. Beneath, his chest was carved with fresh sigils, runes of corn, drawn not in ink but in scars. The flesh still wept blood, but it didn't drip. It floated upward, evaporating into red mist. "I knelt at the altar of one of the blood flowers," Thorn continued. "Gave my oath, gave my rage. The god of war answered." A heartbeat passed. Then the killing began. Thorn moved, faster than human, his blade blurred, and the first to die was a mercenary, cut from shoulder to hip, the strike so clean his body didn't fall until Thorn turned away. Blood erupted like a geyser, painting the others in red. Karn roared and charged, but Thorn caught his hammer mid-swing, stopped it, and drove a mailed fist into Karn's face, shattering bone and teeth. Karn hit the ground, coughing blood, dazed. Issa hissed, her fingers weaving sigils of madness, but Thorn bared his chest and her spells fizzled. The runes drank the magic, devoured it. She screamed as her own power backlashed, her eyes bleeding black tears. "Stop him!" Melis shrieked. But it was already chaos. Thorn had become a butcher priest, a walking font of divine violence. Every strike bled heat and sound. His sword howled as it cut, its edge glowing red-hot. One of the Brazen Claw joined him, throwing off their allegiance to the Alliance and falling on their own former comrades, hacking apart a sorcerer from the Obsidian Vow in a frenzy. The glade dissolved into madness. Flames erupted from the trees as vines twisted in excitement, sensing Khorne's blessing rise like a signal flare. Blood soaked the ground. Rootscar responded, and the air trembled with anticipation. Melis called upon the world root's residual energy, drawing vines and wind to shield her as Thorn bore down on her. Yissa, half-blind and bleeding, hurled herself in front of Melis, her curved dagger clashing with Thorn's blade. They fought, steel on steel, rage against elegance. Thorn struck Issa's shoulder, cleaving down to bone, but she stabbed him in the gut, carving through muscle and rune. They parted, staggered, bleeding. "You think you'll ascend," Issa spat. "You're a pawn." Thorn grinned. "Then I'll be the last pawn standing." Karn rose, broken but breathing, and charged again. This time, he didn't aim to fight clean. He tackled Thorn, driving him into the ground. Fists flew, bones cracked. Thorn punched Karn so hard his jaw dislocated, but Karn bit through his own cheek, took the pain, and slammed a dagger into Thorn's side repeatedly. With a scream of defiance, Karn lifted Thorn bodily and threw him into the shard's basin. The sacred pool still boiled from Vorn's sacrifice. The moment Thorn touched its surface, his body convulsed. Light and blood erupted from every pore. The rune scars rebelled, burned out of his flesh in coils of fire. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He died in silence, his body turned to ash. The glade grew still. The Alliance, fractured, bloodied, but not broken, stood over the betrayer's remains. Melis wiped blood from her eyes, voice cold. "No more pacts, no more gods, only the bloom, only Rootscar. We end it, or we die in its shadow." They turned, wounded and scarred, toward the pulsing horizon. The final war was coming. Chapter 16. Last light of Aelwynthel. Haelwindel wept. The trees, long since corrupted into shrines of torment and war, now trembled in agony. The bloom pulsed erratically, spasming across the forest like a dying beast. Rootscar's scream still echoed across the land, distant, enraged, and wounded. Ah! But it lived. Wounded, not slain. And it grew impatient. The horned glade, once the only untouched sanctuary left, now stood at the brink of annihilation. The wards, etched by Melis, flickered like candlelight in a storm. The golden leaves of the sacred trees had begun to fall, not drifting softly, but plummeting like dying stars. The sky above churned with blood clouds, casting a red haze upon all who remained. Melis stood at the glade's center, alone. She had aged in days. Her once thick hair now hung in strands of gray, and her skin bore the weight of old magics, veins darkened to green, eyes like glowing moss, fingers like brittle twigs. She had given too much already. Vorn's death, the purifying of the shard, and the betrayals had cost her spirit dearly. But she had one act left. Before her, the sacred tree loomed, the ancient stag-shaped idol, the true root, still untouched by corruption. Within it dwelled the echo of Aelwyndel's primal soul, not Rootscar, not a god, but what the forest had been before. Before war, before worship, before chaos. She pressed her forehead to the bark and whispered in the old tongue. Mermaid. The roots parted. With slow, reverent steps Melis entered the tree. Inside was not hollow space, but a memory, an echoing realm of wind and leaves, green fire and glowing veins. The spirit of the forest shimmered before her, a massive being of bark and breath, crowned in leaves, its body forming and unforming like smoke through branches. It had no face, only presence. "You are the last," it said in a voice like wind through stone. "And you are dying." "I know," Melis replied, tears trailing down her cracked cheeks. "You would give your soul for mine?" "Yes," she whispered. "For them. For what you were. For what we might be again." The spirit raised an arm of woven leaves and thorn. "Then die in me, and let the forest burn with light." Outside, the sky cracked. A beam of emerald light burst from the sacred tree, lancing through the clouds like a blade of vengeance. It struck the canopy above and rippled outward. All around the glade the corruption recoiled. Branches snapped backward, vines screamed. Bloom sites collapsed, vomiting blood and bone as they withered into ash. And Rootscar roared. It felt the pain like a nail driven through its skull. The light pierced its form, burning through centuries of layered rage and blasphemy. Its great root limbs buckled. Entire swaths of its monstrous forest body blackened and sloughed away like diseased flesh. Back in the glade, the stag idol shattered. Melis was gone. In her place a single white tree now stood, leafless, thin, glowing faintly with her last breath. The last uncorrupted essence of Aelwyndel's soul. Karn and Nisa staggered into the clearing, bloodied and ragged, their surviving warriors limping behind. They fell to their knees before the tree, silent. The forest beyond still pulsed, still lived, but it was weaker. The bloom had been cut. The war was not over, but for the first time since the blood rain fell, the balance had shifted. The forest had remembered what it once was, and it had fought back. Chapter 17. Siege of the Verdant Maw. They came to it through smoke and ash, blood trailing in their wake. The verdant maw loomed before them, a hellish mouth torn into the belly of Aelwyndel, framed by trees that no longer resembled anything of nature, their trunks twisted in spirals of flesh and bark, gaping with mouths lined with thorns and tongues that lolled and whispered nonsense. Vines dangled like intestines from their branches, and the canopy above glowed with an ominous red light, flickering as if lit by an infernal hearth. This was Rootscar's lair. It had formed at the epicenter of the bloom, where the original corruption had bled deepest into the world root. The maw gaped open, a colossal crater lined with ribs of stone and pulsing root veins. The ground bled in places, a slow seepage of thick crimson that hissed when it touched steel. A massive tree, blackened and knotted, rose from the center like a tower of corpses, twisted limbs clawing toward the corrupted heavens. Ta-ta-ta-ta! Here Rootscar resided, not merely as a spirit, but as a colossus of living hate. Its bulk rose from the ground and disappeared into the canopy above. Its limbs sprawled across the maw's perimeter, forming bridges, walls, and weapons. Its breath was wind, and its heartbeat shook the trees. The remnants of the Alliance stood on the ridgeline. No more than 20 warriors, Karn at their head, bloodied and half-limping, wielding a warhammer stained black with gore. Ysa stood beside him, face pale, her mask shattered, exposing the ruin of one eye. The last of the antlers, the vow, and a few feral warriors who had abandoned gods in favor of sheer survival now formed the final blade aimed at Rootscar's throat. The air here was electric with dread. Karn raised his voice, rough and broken. "We are the wound. The last splinter in Rootscar's side. The forest knows we are here." Below, movement stirred. Hundreds of creatures swarmed the basin, grotesque mockeries of life, beasts formed of bark, bone, and rage. Some crawled, spider-like on roots that oozed acid. Others dragged themselves with shattered limbs, teeth growing from their backs, eyes sprouting on their thighs. They shrieked and howled, and above them Rootscar watched. Its eye, massive, crimson, and unblinking, opened slowly on the tree's trunk. The pupil a churning maelstrom of demonic fury. A sound followed, not from lungs, but from the very earth. A guttural growl, layered with voices both human and not. "You have come to die." Ysa stepped forward, chanting. Symbols bloomed in the air around her, glowing violet and gold. Karn gripped his warhammer and nodded. "We're already dead. We're here to take you with us." Then the maw erupted. From the ground rose Rootscar's sentinels, massive bipedal horrors, their bodies stitched from beasts and men, plated with bark-armored limbs and crowned in horns. One bore a flail made of jawbones, each strike trailing green fire. Another vomited a stream of boiling sap that melted the first warrior to charge it. The final battle began. The warriors descended like lightning, screaming their final oaths. Karn led the charge, leaping onto a monster's back and driving his hammer into its spine until the bone burst through its chest in a shower of black fluid. Ysa followed, loosing waves of soul-severing magic, turning lesser creatures to ash with every gesture. The verdant maw answered. Roots lashed from the walls, dragging men into the depths. Spikes of bone and stone erupted from the ground, skewering 3 mercenaries in a single instant. One was still alive when the tree above opened and drank him through its roots. A banner-bearer from the obsidian vow was caught mid-chant and split down the middle by a scything vine that buzzed with hornet-like wings. His halves twitched, crawling toward each other even as they died. Karn reached the base of the black tree. He swung wildly, clearing a path through a swarm of shrieking blood blossoms. Behind him warriors fell, one by one. A woman he had fought beside for years was crushed under a root the width of a wagon. She didn't scream, only stared at him as the light in her eyes vanished. Ysa and Karn pressed deeper. Above, Rootscar moved. Its massive bulk shifted within the maw, branches lashing, roots retracting to protect the eye. It knew. Melis' sacrifice had weakened it, but not destroyed it. Now it would fight. And below, in the belly of the maw, the last of Aelwindle's warriors made their stand, in a battlefield of meat, madness, and memory. Blades clashed, bones broke, blood soaked the soil until the earth could no longer drink. The siege had begun. The end was coming. Chapter 18. Blood against bark. The maw split wide like a laughing wound. From its depths, Rootscar rose, not as a shadow, not as an echo, but in full, terrifying form. A god being birthed from soil and slaughter. Towering over the battlefield, it emerged on 4 great limbs of gnarled root and sinew, its body a cathedral of horror. Bone-wrapped trunks, sinew vines strung like tendon bridges, and flanks coated in fused corpses, some fresh, others ancient, all still alive, writhing and whispering in endless agony. Its head bore the semblance of a beast and a stag, crowned in a broken rack of iron antlers weeping molten sap. Below them, its face split open like a flower, revealing not a mouth but an enormous eye, blazing red with concentric rings that pulsed like a war drum. Its breath, when it exhaled, was a gale of blistering wind that turned exposed skin to cracked leather in seconds. The ground beneath it curdled, plants wilted, rocks melted, blood boiled in veins. Rootscar had come to fight, and the forest sang in response. The maw's basin erupted. Vine beasts poured from the walls, shrieking like children drowning. Thorned golems, pulsing with the stolen hearts of fallen warriors, thundered forward. The very roots beneath the enemy's feet rose up to fight back, tearing at boots, piercing flesh, dragging the dying into the dirt. Karn roared, charging through a wave of Rootscar's spawn. His hammer shattered a vine beast's skull in a single arc, but not before its spines flayed his right thigh. He fell to one knee, swearing, only to see another charging him. A bolt of violet light obliterated it mid-leap. Issa, hovering above on a platform of floating roots, her hands gleaming with magic and blood. "Don't die yet, warhound," she hissed. "We've a god to kill." Rootscar turned its eye upon them. The temperature spiked. A pulse of red lightning shot from the eye, blasting a hole through the ground that incinerated 4 of the Alliance in an instant. No screams, only dust. Bark-covered tendrils as thick as tree trunks lashed out, grabbing survivors and slamming them into the maw's walls, until their bodies burst like overripe fruit. But this was no one-sided slaughter. The Alliance struck back. Karn hurled himself at Rootscar's legs, hammer flashing with fire from one of Issa's enchantments. The blow cracked bark, exposing a gash that leaked not sap, but blood. Rootscar roared, 1,000 screams echoing from its bark-ribbed lungs. Nissa weaved sigils in the air, forming glyphs that exploded on impact. Each blast tore bark from the colossus, burning vines to ash. One particularly large detonation tore an entire arm-like root from its socket, sending it crashing into the maw wall, killing dozens of Rootscar's own spawn. The battle was chaos made flesh. Amid the carnage, warriors were forced to confront more than flesh and wood, the bloom whispered. Each survivor felt tested. One of Issa's sorceresses froze mid-cast, eyes widening as she saw her dead lover crawling from a bloom beside her, begging her to stop. She hesitated, and a root speared her chest, lifting her high before ripping her in two. Karn, injured and breath ragged, heard his father's voice, long dead, urging him to give up the fight, that it wasn't worth it, that the gods had already chosen. He nearly dropped his hammer, until he saw one of his dying men, legless, dragging himself forward just to get one more swing in at a crawling horror. Karn screamed and kept fighting. Even Issa faltered. The eye turned to her alone, and her mind was invaded. She saw herself on a throne of blossoms, crowned in petals, worshipped by daemons and mortals alike. Eternal beauty, eternal ecstasy. She smiled, wanted it, until she remembered Melis, face bathed in green light, dying with purpose. Issa spat blood and carved a rune of refusal into the air, sending a shockwave that tore a dozen of Rootscar's faces from its torso. The colossus stumbled, wounded, roaring, fading, but not yet dead. The survivors, fewer than a dozen now, rallied beneath Karn's bellow. They surged forward, blades flashing, spells shattering the air, hurling themselves against a god wrapped in bark and wrath. Above, the sky split open. The solstice had arrived, and the final bloom was upon them. Chapter 19. The Grove Burns. The sky split open like an old scar torn anew. The solstice had arrived, and with it the forest ignited, not with fire alone, but with divine fury and demonic wrath in equal measure. The very air cracked with tension, the pressure of two realities grinding together. From above, the stars twisted, forming symbols not of gods, but judgment. Below, the verdant moss screamed as blood and bark churned like boiling mud. At the heart of it all, Rootscar reeled. Its mountainous form swayed, great root limbs staggering under the onslaught. Chunks of its barked flesh had been blasted away, revealing wet, oozing veins that throbbed with unholy rhythm. One leg dragged uselessly, torn by a collapsing ridge. Its antler crown cracked, one horn shattered. Its eye, once blazing, now flickered with strain. And still it fought. Each lash of its tendrils felled warriors like wheat beneath a scythe. One vine-wrapped beast caught a survivor mid-leap and crushed him in half, splattering blood in a sickening bloom. The earth quaked beneath Rootscar's steps, and with every roar lesser creatures spawned from the roots like tumors, snarling things of thorn and sinew. Karn's hammer was broken. Issa's hands were blistered and bleeding, the glyphs she wove now flickering with instability. Only 5 of the Alliance still stood, drenched in blood, barely upright, held together by hate and the memory of purpose. Then the light came. It struck like a silent spear, descending not from the heavens, but from the shard. Atop a ridge behind the battlefield, glowing with a green so bright it cast shadows from flame, stood Ilar Vorn. He had returned, but he was not as he once was. His body shimmered with the purified essence of the world root, vines wrapped gently around his arms and legs, pulsing with life. His eyes no longer burned with vengeance, but resolve. Moss clung to his chest like armor. The earth beneath his feet grew lush even amid the carnage. In his hand was the shard blade, a weapon forged of crystal and root, glowing with the same light that had once ignited the horned glade. Melis's legacy, born anew in his grip. "Rootscar!" he roared, voice cutting through the chaos. The behemoth turned its cyclopean gaze upon him and screamed. He had remembered. It knew. Rootscar launched 100 roots toward him. Vorn ran. The battlefield parted in his wake. The shard blade sang, a pure note of defiance. Roots burst from the ground to block Rootscar's lashes, sacrificing themselves to give Vorn passage. Flames flickered around him, some demonic, some divine, and did not touch him. His body smoked with light and ash. Karn saw and screamed, "Now!" Issa hurled her last spell, a spiraling cyclone of vines and soul fire that clamped Rootscar's limbs down, pinning the Titan for a breath. A heartbeat, a single gasp in the eye of a god's storm. Rin leapt and plunged the shard blade into Rootscar's chest, into the eye. The blade met flesh, bark, and soul. The reaction was instant. Rootscar erupted. Not exploded. Erupted, a volcano of blood and light. Fire of every color blasted skyward. The crater filled with screaming as the beast convulsed, limbs flailing, antlers striking the air like spears against the stars. Its eye cracked, splintered, and broke, releasing not pus but green light. The world root's last breath. Purity surged through the colossus like poison. Its limbs curled, its screams turned shrill and childlike. The grove shook violently as massive trees toppled, setting off chain reactions of collapse. Fire caught in the roots, racing along paths of dried blood. The demonic flora turned to ash, hissing as the divine energy ate through their corruption. Vaughn did not withdraw the blade. He drove it deeper, using his entire body, screaming in effort and agony as Rootscar began to implode. The body buckled, the roots recoiled, and then, with one final blinding pulse of green-white flame, Rootscar died. Its form split open, a cleaving rupture from base to crown, and collapsed into the crater in a shriek of torn souls. What remained was not victory, but silence. The forest burned, not with chaos, but cleansing. The blood rains ceased, the sky cleared, and the grove, for the first time in centuries, wept clean tears. Chapter 20. Midsummer's End. The forest was silent. Not the quiet of peace, not the hush of slumber, but the stillness that follows obliteration. Where once trees had loomed like titans, their canopies blotting out the sun, now lay blackened husks, spindly and skeletal, clawing upward at a sky no longer red, but pale with ash. Aelwindle, the ancient woodland, the once living soul of the Empire's wild heart, was dead. The fires had burned all night. Now they smoldered in the charred bones of the verdant maw, curling tendrils of smoke rising from collapsed roots and shattered stone altars. The maw itself had caved in, sealing the portal with molten root rock and shards of divine crystal, like a great mouth stitched shut with iron and light. The bloom was gone. Rootscar was no more. But the price had been monstrous. Only 5 had survived. Karn sat slumped against a blackened boulder, one arm gone from the elbow, the other clutching his blood-caked warhammer like a relic. He stared without blinking into the pit where Rootscar had died. His breath was shallow, his skin burned raw, yet he was alive, and that he neither celebrated nor mourned. Issa stood nearby, robes in tatters, her once golden hair now a streaked, matted mess of blood and soot. Her face bore no mask, no pretense, just an empty stare. Her magic was spent. Her voice, once melodic and mocking, was silent. 2 others, nameless, half-mad, wandered the crater's edge, murmuring to themselves in broken tongues. One dragged a string of severed tongues from Rootscar's spawn behind him like a leash. The other spoke only to the trees that no longer breathed. And Vaughn stood alone. He had pulled the shard blade from Rootscar's eye before the collapse. Now it hung across his back, its light dimmed, its roots receding. His armor was fused to his skin in places. His left side bore deep, bark-like ridges where the world root had marked him, claimed him. His eyes, once blue, now shimmered faint green beneath a layer of fatigue so deep it went beyond the body. He looked out across what had once been a cathedral of chaos and growth, now reduced to a skeletal graveyard. Black stalks, ash, mounds of bone. Fields where skulls once bloomed now lay flattened, empty, stripped of power. He took a breath. It tasted of smoke and memory. Behind him, Yissa limped closer. "Will you stay?" she asked, voice hoarse. "No," he said. "The forest is dead." "It should be," Vaughn replied. "Some things don't deserve to grow again." She looked at him, her face unreadable. "And you?" Vaughn touched the ridged flesh on his chest. "I walked through blood. Killed for gold, for survival, for nothing. Then I bled for life, for the land. I remember it all." "You carry the shard's mark," she said. They carry the forest's wound. She said nothing more. She knew what that meant. He turned away from her, from the crater, from the smoke, and walked, step by step, out of the ruined maw, past the charred bones of creatures once fed by gods, past trees that whispered no longer, past memories turned to rot. He did not look back. As the sun finally rose, truly rose for the first time in weeks, its light did not filter through leaves. It struck dead soil. But in one patch, high above the crater, on the lip of ruin, a single green shoot had broken through the ash. And for a moment, just a breath, it shimmered. The blood had bloomed. Now something else might grow,